Hi, this is Philip Anthony Albertelli, and welcome to The Week in Doubt, episode 59. Today's episode is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download at www.audibletrial.com/The Week in Doubt. Over 100,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Before we get started, I'd like to thank my friend Michelle for liking The Week in Doubt on Facebook. Thanks, Michelle. Okay, so the topic of today's show is the historicity of Jesus, or to put it frankly, did Jesus exist? I know that for believers and even mainstream thinkers in general, this might seem like an absurd or brazenly biased question. After all, you don't really hear people questioning whether other ancient figures like Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar really existed. But that brings up a point that I've often given thought to. I think skeptics might tend to question Jesus' existence either fairly or unfairly because they question his supposed divine nature and his reputation as being a miracle worker. But I think another reason why people may tend to question the existence of a historical Jesus is because of the seeming lack of archaeological evidence. In the case of figures like Alexander of Macedon or other worldly conquerors or prominent figures, we often have statues and edifices erected in their lifetime, coinage bearing their likeness, etc. But in the case of Jesus, in fairness, he was a first century Jew who, despite his reported fame, was of humble means. He wasn't a conqueror who erected statues or left grand edifices behind. He was a supposed wandering wonder worker, healer, teacher. So other than reports of his words and deeds, he probably wouldn't have left much of a historical footprint. And then there's also the ancient Jewish prohibition barring the creation of graven images, especially those depicting a human being. So it's not like we would have coins or graven images bearing his likeness from his own time. Now, one of my favorite atheist thinkers, one of my favorite people in general, is the late Christopher Hitchens. And I remember the one opinion of Christopher Hitchens that I used to disagree with was his assertion that Christ may not have even existed. I thought maybe it was evidence of some masochistic need to throw red meat to his Christian opponents. But I recently discovered that there's this whole class of scholars that refers to themselves as mythicists. Yeah, I just trip over my own tongue. Mythicists. Mythicists because they believe that Christ was merely a mythological figure. And I suppose in a sense you could kind of call it a fringe movement because it kind of goes against mainstream scholarship, but at the same time I hesitate to call it a fringe movement because it includes some very well-trained scholars. It's probably safe to say that one of the most popular or well-known of the so-called mythicists is Richard Carrier. He's a professor of ancient history with degrees from Columbia and UC Berkeley. I found a couple of his lectures on YouTube, and I found them very interesting, perhaps even convincing to some degree. He seems to have kind of a defiant or strident personality, although I did see a debate between him and the renowned or infamous, depending on what you think of him, Christian apologist William Lane Craig. And to be honest, I thought Craig got the better of him, perhaps even making Carrier look foolish at times. But that may have been a while ago. Carrier is kind of a youthful looking 40-something, but in the debate with William Lane Craig, he looks like a kid. It seems that it's not just Christian apologists Carrier clashes with. I guess he also has a feud going with Bart Ehrman. I've mentioned Bart D. Ehrman on the... There I go again. Whenever I pronounce his middle initial, it sounds like I have a speech impediment. Bart D. Ehrman. Okay, so I've mentioned him on the show before. He's a well-known author and biblical scholar with a PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary, as well as holding various other degrees from other institutions. Bart Ehrman used to be a believer, and I believe he was even a pastor for a time. He now considers himself an agnostic with atheistic leanings. Richard Carrier is, to my understanding, a full-fledged atheist. Despite the fact that, like myself, they're both more or less non-believers, they have been embroiled in a feud, as I mentioned. And I think it all started with a really kind of brutal online review or critique by Richard Carrier of Professor Ehrman's recent book entitled Did Jesus Exist? A Historical Argument for Jesus of Nazareth. Not only does Carrier disagree with Ehrman's premise that there was a historical Jesus, but he also goes for the jugular and accuses Ehrman repeatedly of bad scholarship and shoddy research. I believe he actually says, and this is close to verbatim, that Ehrman's book, quote unquote, sucks. Uh, it's funny. Carrier must really be a controversial figure because when I read the description below one of his lecture videos I'd been watching on YouTube, the uploader offered a warning not to believers but to other atheists to not post anything derogatory about Professor Carrier. So I thought that was pretty amusing. Apparently he's controversial even within the atheist community. Anyway, so what do Richard Carrier and mythicists in general tend to believe about Jesus? So, as I said, their basic premise is that Jesus was a myth. And it seems that at the heart of Richard Carrier's argument against a historical Jesus is the belief that Jesus was just another of many so called rising and dying gods in the ancient world. Anyone familiar with world mythology or ancient history is probably aware that certainly there were many quote unquote dying and rising gods in the ancient world. There was the Egyptian Osiris, the Greek Dionysus, one of my personal favorites. I believe Carrier also includes the Sumerian goddess Inanna, but he emphasizes that the Persian god Mithras or Mithra, although popular in the classical world, was not truly a dying and rising god. But he was kind of a savior figure. He mentions a correlation between Jesus and other savior figures like Romulus, the mythical or semi-mythical founder of Rome, and Heracles or Hercules, choose your favorite spelling and pronunciation. I don't know if he was saying that Romulus and Hercules were dying and rising figures or simply saying they were savior-type figures. I guess in a weird way you could say Hercules was a dying and rising figure. If I remember the myth correctly, at the end of his mortal life, Hercules is immolated and all his corrupt mortal parts are burned away, and he then ascends to Olympus to join the gods. And when talking about dying and rising gods and savior figures, Carrier uses a term I hadn't heard before but found very fascinating. It's called euhemerization, and it's named for a Greek writer named Euhemerus, who used to write historical type biographies for mythical figures such as Zeus. So the term euhemerize means to create a historical biography for a mythological figure or to surround them in a historical context. And Carrier's assertion is that it may be the case that Jesus started out as this kind of mythical celestial savior figure who was later euhemerized. Just as Mithras was a Persian deity adopted by the Greco-Roman world and Osiris an Egyptian one, according to this theory, Jesus was in like fashion a Jewish deity or savior figure adopted by Greco-Roman culture. Just one more fashionable, multicultural, dying and rising god in a sense. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with this line of thinking, but I'm just trying to give you some insight into at least one mythicist view of the origins of Christianity. So Richard Carrier may have some controversial views, but he is, in my opinion, at least a fairly impressive and formidable scholar. He used some other terms I found interesting as well. There was syncretism, which means combining a foreign cult deity with Hellenistic elements, which applies to what I was just talking about. He also mentions what he referred to as monotheistic trend, which he claims was much more common than we're traditionally led to believe. And that's when polytheism transforms into monotheism via, and here's another big word, henotheism. And henotheism is a kind of pseudo-monotheism where you have one prominent god who is supreme over a pantheon of lesser gods or beings. And in a sense, you could say the Judeo-Christian tradition is henotheistic. There's the God of the Old Testament, but there's also myriad other entities such as Satan, Mary, the divine mother figure, and myriad other angels and intermediary beings. There's the concept of the Trinity, three divine beings who are simultaneously one. In the case of Catholicism, at least, there's the myriad saints who often seem to enjoy borderline divine status, or what some would say as excessive veneration. Of course, that would come to be one of the complaints of the Reformation. I guess my point is that even the great monotheistic religions of the world may not be quite as monotheistic as we would think. Another argument that Richard Carrier brought up is what he referred to as the argument from silence, meaning that in Carrier's opinion, sources seem to be suspiciously silent about the historical Jesus, especially in his opinion in the letters of Paul, which, as I believe when Chris Webber was on the show recently, he had mentioned that the letters of Paul actually date earlier than the Gospels. According to Carrier, any mention of a historical pre-resurrection Jesus in the writings of Paul are most likely forged, a claim I imagine mainstream New Testament scholars would probably take some issue with. So I know that I've laid out the mythicist worldview, at least that of Richard Carrier. What does Bart Ehrman think? Well, despite being agnostic with atheistic leanings, as mentioned earlier, Bart Ehrman has a much more mainstream opinion when it comes to the question of the historicity of Jesus. Ehrman believes that, for instance, there is mention of a historical Jesus in the writings of Paul, most notably via Paul's supposed association with the Apostle Peter and with James, the brother of the Lord, quote unquote. As Ehrman jokes, Jesus' brother should know whether or not he existed. One of the most famous sources scholars often point to for proof of historical Jesus is a section from the Antiquities of Flavius Josephus, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, in which he describes the condemnation and crucifixion of Jesus. Scholars seem divided on the authenticity of the passage. Skeptical scholars think it was either completely inserted later on by a Christian scribe or scribes, or that it may have originally contained a kernel about a historical Jesus, but was later elaborated on by scribes. There's also mention of John the Baptist and James, the brother of Jesus, in the writings of Josephus. And as far as I can tell, most scholars think those are the real deal. There was also another early historian known as Thallus, whose works were repeated by another historian known as Sextus Julius Africanus. Supposedly, these writings make mention of the darkness that supposedly accompanied the crucifixion, but scholars are once again divided over the validity of the text. And even though I'm not his biggest fan, Christian apologist William Lane Craig, I think, makes a good point when he says that why would Christians make up a story about a crucified Messiah when the Jewish Messiah traditionally was supposed to be this grand kind of warrior figure, and crucifixion was an extremely humiliating death. I suppose maybe a mythicist could counter argue that if, according to that worldview, Christ is supposed to be a rising and dying God, following the template of other rising and dying gods, then the idea of being crucified and rising again is in keeping with that tradition. But, at the end of the day, do I think there was a historical Jesus? I really don't know. I have to admit I'm still kind of confused and groping in the dark on this one. So your educated guess is as good as mine. And this is an episode I've wanted to do for a while, and I'm glad I finally got around to it. And I've only been going for about 15 minutes now, and it's a very controversial and rich topic. So I'm sure there's lots of points I didn't touch on, and I've probably only scratched the surface, but I hope you enjoyed this episode, and whether you're a believer or a non-believer, I hope it's given you food for thought. And with that being said, thank you as always for listening to The Week in Doubt. You can like the Weekend Out Facebook page. You can visit the Weekend Out YouTube channel. You can leave a review or subscribe through iTunes or Podbean. And thank you very much. Any support is much appreciated.